Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Henney with Project Q Atlanta. Welcome and thanks to everyone joining us today. It's another episode of Q Conversations, our virtual event series about LGBTQ issues. We're here today to talk about efforts by Georgia lawmakers to make sweeping changes to how elections are held and put in place new voting restrictions in the wake of the state turning blue in the November elections and January runoffs. Joining me today are three LGBTQ experts in get out the vote efforts, grassroots organizing, and voting requirements. There's Representative Renitta Shannon, whose work on the State House Governmental Affairs Committee has included efforts to fix actual voting problems in the state. Thanks for joining us again, Renitta.
Thank you for having me.
Also here is Nsé Ufot, CEO of the New Georgia Project and New Georgia Project Action Fund. The organizations work to educate and register people of color across the state. Hi, Nsé.
Hello.
And you're joining us. You're all social distance and outside on this mostly nice day today. So
I am. I'm trying to be okay with the change in weather. But I'm shivering. But it also gives me an opportunity to accessorize.
And finally, there's Jerry Gonzalez, the founder and CEO of the Georgia Association of Latino Elected Officials and the Galeo Latino Community Development Fund. The statewide organizations work to increase civic engagement and leadership development of the Latinx community across Georgia. Hey, Jerry.
Hey, Matt. Good to be with you all.
And Jerry, you look like on the complete opposite of Nsé. You look like you're in an office with no windows. So I'm sorry about that.
We got some windows.
Also here today is Project Q's Mike Fleming, who is moderating online chat, which is to the right of your screen. Drop your comments in there during the event. And if you have any questions for our guests, please put those in the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of your screen. We'll be answering those during the event. So with that, we will get started. Wanted to direct the first question to Nsé. I know she has a scheduling conflict, won't be here for the whole event, so I'll get her the first question. Nsé, in all of the grassroots work that the New Georgia Project did last year ahead of the June primary, the November election, the January runoff, did you ever think at some point, hey, what Georgia needs is to make it harder for people to vote?
Never, not once. And listen, and my mind wanders. Never was a reason. It's incredible. I think that this beautiful moment that we're in, right, where much has been written, much has been said about the browning of America and our sort of multiracial, multi-ethnic, multilingual future, and what that means for our country. And it's here in Georgia now. That's our reality today. And instead of embracing it, welcoming it, and figuring out, what this means for the future of policy and our politics and our communities, we have some who will try to fight the future and in the most anti-democratic way, make it more difficult for people to vote and to try to hold on to power and sort of make it power grab, shameful power grab. So no, I never once thought that, and am disappointed and shamed by those who do.
Will you talk a little bit give some background about what the New Georgia Project, what your work was in the last election cycle?
Yeah, so New Georgia Project is a nonpartisan civic engagement organization. Ultimately, our goal is to register young people and people of color to vote, to innovate around voter education, to try to talk about the policy opportunities in our state in ways that are not corny. And to mobilize people, to move people to action. That action could be voting, grassroots lobbying, participating in some of the community service events that we do, providing mutual aid, direct services to those in need, but moving people to action is what we do. And at the core of it all is a very bold, very aggressive research agenda. We build video games, we build apps, that are all designed to sort of demystify how campaigns work, how elections work, and to plug in some of the holes that are in Georgia's elections infrastructure. When I think about the work that we did in 2020, we have been building to this moment. Um, we are looking we're part of an ecosystem of some powerful organizations that are needed in order to win and win for Georgia families and then defend those wins beyond one election cycle. So it's, the work of elections, but also the work that happens in between elections. And so, I think we're probably best known for our voter registration work. Today, we've registered over 500,000 Georgians in all 159 of Georgia's counties. In the 9 weeks between the November general and the January runoff, we knocked on over 2 million doors. We made over 7 million phone calls. We sent over 4 million text messages. I think we did some of the best ads that they certainly rival, no offense, but Warnock and Off. I mean, those are the homies. We absolutely love them. And you can tell the creative that's done by people in community versus the creative that's done by consultants. So yeah, I think that our goal is to try to show up. Our focus this year was, the 7 cities and what is known as Georgia's rural Black belt. Right? I think that oftentimes people think that rural voter is code for white conservative, and that's just not the case in Georgia at all. I mean, yes, obviously there are definitely white conservatives in rural parts of the state, but what's really interesting and what's much more true is that there are white progressives and people of color. There are nearly 20 counties in Georgia that are majority people of color, and most of them are rural. DeKalb County is actually an exception, the minority, quite frankly, as opposed to, again, much of the counties that make up what's known as Georgia's rural Black belt. So, yeah, I think we are a part of an ecosystem. We are trying to build infrastructure that's again designed to make sure that our families win, that people can be treated with dignity, regardless of race or gender identity or sexual orientation or wealth. And I try to show up and make sure that Jerry and the good folks at Galileo have an organization that can look to that when we need to squad up and mob up like Voltron, that we can get together to defeat the enemies of progress.
Well, and I just wanted to run through. There's been a flurry of election and voting bills filed by Republicans this week, and they would end automatic opt-in voter registration when you get a driver's license. They would end no excuse absentee voting. They would get rid of the absentee ballot drop boxes. They would require a photo ID to vote with an absentee ballot. They would ban nonprofit groups from mailing absentee ballot applications to voters. They would prohibit new Georgia residents from voting in runoffs. They would expand poll watcher access. And then the latest one that I saw would require Georgia residents who are not U.S. citizens to have stamped across the top of their ID, bearer not a U.S. citizen, not voter ID. Renitta, is that all of them? What's your take on this legislative onslaught this week?
So that's not all of them, but as we've said before, this really is an attempt to make sure that Georgia is never able to have the turnout that we saw in the presidential election or in the U.S. Senate races. We saw historic turnout from Black and brown communities. And so many of these bills, we can go down a list, are things that Republicans actually put in place when mostly white voters were using some of these things. So, for example, the right to be able to vote absentee without an excuse, that is something that Republicans actually moved forward and passed in Georgia when they thought primarily white voters were using that form of that process to vote. The ending automatic voter registration, that's a change that Governor Deal made. So you can just really see what these bills are about. It is literally the case that they understand that Black and brown voters have showed up in mass. Younger voters showed up in mass in the previous elections, thanks to the work of organizations like Galileo and New Georgia Project. Voters have shown up, and they know just from looking at elections throughout recent history that the more people who vote, the less of a chance the GOP has to win. So they know they cannot win on values. So they are trying to win by just making sure that everyone cannot participate in democracy. We have a representative democracy in this country, or that is a goal that we strive for. And so democracy is actually better when more participate. And they just have, the GOP has just decided to take has just decided to move forward with undemocratic ways. And that's really just what is at the heart of this. The other thing I'll mention too, so one of the bills that you did not talk about, but what came out of this new committee that they just formed to work on election laws, they passed a bill out of committee that basically would have a cutoff of 10 days before an election would be the last day you could request an absentee ballot. So that right there, the consistent changing of the rules mid-game is what makes it difficult for folks to vote, because who can keep up with the changes? People have jobs to work, they have families to support and take care of. They don't have time to babysit the legislature, and the GOP is doing all it can to create confusion to make it harder to vote in Georgia, and we know why.
And Jerry, can you talk a little bit about what your organization did during the election cycle, the most recent election cycle, and then how these bills and proposals would impact that work going forward?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Certainly appreciate everybody's efforts associated with what we're talking about here. It's really important for our democracy to continue to have free and fair access to elections, so people that are U.S. citizens can exercise their right to vote in the ways that they should be able to. I think part of the history that was made in Georgia with record participation should not be stymied and should not be pushed back for a false narrative of fraud. And elected officials really need to push back instead of reacting to the falsehoods and the alternative reality that people live in with regards to issues that happened with the elections that didn't really happen. They should tell people the truth. They shouldn't change policy based on lies. We should change policy based on fact. The fact is Georgia's becoming more diverse. Georgia needs greater access, language access for folks that represent this diverse community. Georgia needs same-day voter registration to alleviate a lot of the problems that happen on election day. So there's a lot of change that does need to happen to make the elections freer and fairer to people. But what they're doing is they're trying to pay tribute to a false narrative of lies. Elected officials have a responsibility to stand up against these lies, push back on these lies, and educate voters about the reality of the situation. Is we need to expand access to voting rather than decrease access to voting, and that's a shame that they're doing that. So in this last election cycle, as Nsé pointed out to, it's been decades in the making. When we started as an organization, there were only 10,000 Latinos registered to vote. Now it's well over 250,000 Latinos registered to vote. And there were record participation in the 2020 election. But something that, if you hadn't been paying attention to Georgia, one thing that's really important and key is that the Latino electorate has been outperforming the national Latino voter participation rate for several election cycles already. So there's been a tremendous amount of work that was done. We're living in a pandemic. We had to pivot a lot to texting, phone banking, rather than going door to door. We did a lot on social media. We did a lot on Spanish media. And we had to innovate and do contactless lit drops, visiting homes in targeted Latino communities to make sure that the Latino electorate showed up to vote. So those are some of the things that I think we did, and my general reaction with what's happening at the legislature.
Renitta, there's seems to be some, I don't know if consensus is the right word, but some support for maybe among lawmakers, but even some support in the public for adding. There's one proposal that would add a requirement for some sort of ID for an absentee ballot, and then others of these measures. Even the House Speaker has come out and has not supported some of them. So, can you kind of give a take on? Is there any kind of consensus building at the legislature as far as which of these proposals have legs and which don't?
I mean, I would disagree that there is bipartisan support for folks having to prove their ID in order to vote absentee. Absentee voting is already a process that you have to take a lot of steps and jump through a lot of hurdles in order to even be able to use. A lot of people don't know this, but first of all, you have to request an absentee application. Okay, that's the first step. That has to be mailed back to the address that you are registered to vote at. So that's step number one. If you were actually engaging in voter fraud, it would be hard for you to even just get past that one hurdle. So you have to be thinking about the election early enough to ask for an application, turn in the application back to the Secretary of State's office. Then the Secretary of State's office has to then send you a ballot. You have to fill it out. You turn in the ballot, then your signature has to be matched to make sure it matches what is on file. So absentee voting is already a process that can be very difficult for a lot of folks. So it is not one that I believe that people should have to scan their IDs and put it in the mail. That does not have bipartisan support in the General Assembly. I think that the Republicans just can't have it both ways. And I'm sorry that, I'm not sorry about what I'm saying, that it seems so partisan, because you just have to call out what they're doing. And it's important to call out when people are moving in ways that are not democratic. They are really seeking to make it more difficult for folks to use the absentee voting process. And that's just really what it is. The interesting thing is, when Georgia was getting so much pressure from former President Trump and other Trump officials about whether or not there were fraud in the elections, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger and Gabriel Sterling and his team repeatedly said over and over again, there's just no evidence of widespread or really any voter fraud in this election. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say that our elections are accurate and that they do run correctly and that they don't have fraud, yet we need to make all of these changes to get rid of fraud that is not happening. I mean, it's really a solution that's looking for a problem that does not exist. And I would add that, again, just to kind of hammer home the point again, these folks who are saying that our elections are accurate and that our elections are taking place properly, which they are the same folks who are helping to advance the myth of voter fraud. They're the same folks who are helping to advance these myths that we really need to do something about our election system.
So there's a question from Ralph Beckworth in our audience. Is there legislative support to stop these proposals? Can organizations like the ACLU and the AARP be involved early to help combat these?
Do you want me to answer this? Or Sure. Yeah. So we have folks like myself have proactively filed legislation over the last decade to make sure that we actually make good changes to the way our electoral system works. For example, I filed a bill last year to say that if you touch any part of government where you're having to sign an affidavit that you are who you say you are, you'll be automatically registered to vote. So that's basically to expand automatic voter registration. Folks have filed bills that would actually improve allowing more to participate in democracy. Those bills have not received committee hearings and they have not come to the floor. I do think there's an opportunity for organizations to get involved. In fact, when people ask me what can I do in the general public, I say to them, listen, there are organizations like New Georgia Project, Galeo, ACLU that already make it their business to stay on top of these issues. So where you may not have the time to track every single thing that is going on, get keyed in with these organizations, sign up for their email distribution list, sign up for their social media accounts, because they'll keep you aware and they'll let you know what it is that you need to do. And then, of course, in the weekly newsletter that I send out to my district, which it doesn't matter if you live in House District 84 or not, I always include action items for what you can do to fight back against bad voter suppression bills. Everybody really needs to be engaged.
And Jerry, I guess same question to you. What are you and your folks doing concerning these legislative proposals?
Yeah, we're working with our partners in Pro Georgia State Table, Civic Engagement Table, and we're working against these efforts wholeheartedly. Again, part of the responsibility lies on elected officials pushing back on the false narrative of the fraud that supposedly happened in this last election. I mean, those lies caused a deadly insurrection at our Capitol, and pushing legislation like this is furthering that narrative and continuing to enable that narrative to go forward, and is really a detriment to our democracy. Is not in an election. It is about making sure that we can raise our voices and speak up against initiatives that will limit our abilities to exercise our right to vote. So this is where people need to get involved in this process. We need to make sure that you call your elected officials, your state representatives and state senators, and let them know that you're not going to be standing by, idly by, and allow this rolling back of voting rights to happen. Georgia voters showed up to vote. Many Republican voters utilized no excuse absentee ballots outside of the core metro Atlanta area. So this is not just going to impact Black and brown communities and LGBT communities. It's going to impact every single Georgia voter. And really, they shouldn't be pushing those efforts. So we're going to be fighting hard. We're going to be making calls to voters to connect them with their elected officials. We're going to be sending texts to voters to make sure that they get connected to elected officials. So there's a lot of efforts that we're going to be doing collectively to make sure that we can continue to engage with voters, not just in the voting process that we did a great job of for both the general election and the runoff election, but also in defending our democracy.
Okay, great. And Renitta, you're on the House Governmental Affairs Committee, and last year the committee actually, in the wake of the June primaries and some of the difficulties that happened with those elections, had some hearings to look into that and try to address those issues. Can you kind of recap what's going on with that committee? And now there's a special committee on election integrity where some of this legislation is coming out of.
Sure. So I've served on the Governmental Affairs Committee ever since being sworn in 2017. This committee is set up to handle all things that have to do with election law, as well as other government processes and things like incorporation, annexation bills, things like that. I will say that every single year that I've been in the legislature, we have consistently seen bills come through this committee that are meant to suppress the vote. We never really see anything that will actually help to increase participation in voting. We've just seen, you think about the exact match law that came through this committee, just always a consistent string of bills meant to advance voter suppression. Last year, we started to have committee meetings after session, after the primary, because there were really long lines during the June primary. And so our committee met over the summer to basically figure out what we could do to make voting easier. Those committee meetings were helpful. Some of the things that came out of that were just helping the counties figure out how they could make voting more accessible and what they could do to get ready for the November elections. This is important because what we saw, how easily voting, the way that the voting turned out in November, and the way that you did not see lots of media footage about long lines and people having to leave because they couldn't vote. All of that was a result of the work that we had done all year along with the counties to make sure that voting would be easier and more accessible in November. So that's one of the reasons why we know that the election did run. It was one of the best elections we've had in Georgia in a while, the November elections. Since that time, I would say after Trump lost in November elections, our committee turned into basically an arm of the Trump campaign started using our committee to basically come to Georgia and say that there were fraud in the elections. I remember several days in December, even at 2 days before Christmas, us in the committee having to fight with people like Rudy Giuliani, who were, zooming in to say that Georgia needed to go to Trump, even though that would not allow him to get the electoral votes that he would need anyways to succeed Joe Biden in becoming the next president. He still was very focused on Georgia. And so as a result of that, our committee was involved in having to defend the state elections and having to defend the voter participation that we saw in the elections. We definitely did defend that. Folks like myself, Representative B. Wynn, Representative Oliver, former minority leader. We did do we did the heavy lifting of defending our elections and really trying to beat back the attempts at voter suppression for upcoming elections. And since that point, I think that we may have done too good of a job, because they have now come up with a new committee that is called a Special Committee on the Integrity of Elections. And It has most Democrats that it has mostly Democrats who've never served on governmental affairs or ever had to defend against voter suppression bills from the perspective of having to work on election law. And that committee has already met. And as I said before, they have already passed one bill out of that committee that includes a cutoff date for requesting your absentee ballot. The other thing that folks should know, just to understand how insidious this entire thing is that the committees are always stacked 3-1, meaning you will see 20 Republicans and maybe only 4 or 5 Democrats. And that's exactly what this special committee on election integrity looks like. So just a handful of Democrats to defend Georgia's democracy.
Well, and that's one of the things. I mean, there's been many astounding and surprising things as this has unfolded, but that's what really struck me was remembering what the committee, the Governmental Affairs Committee, did after June, and then by December, how the role of the committee had changed, just like you said, because of it was basically taken over and used as a mouthpiece to air these unsubstantiated claims about the election. But it was
Mm-hmm.
in the summer it was so constructive, and by December that effort had just sort of changed and fallen apart. It was pretty stark to me.
Mm-hmm.
So throughout last year, and particularly in the run-up to the November election and the runoffs in January, there were unprecedented efforts to turn out LGBTQ and equality voters. Should LGBTQ Georgians be concerned about these efforts to restrict voting and these proposals that have come about?
Absolutely. It's why I bring up history, because history is so important. It doesn't surprise me what Republicans are doing to try to restrict voter access and to advance voter suppression. If you look at it in this country, Democrats have won the majority of the popular vote for several presidential elections. Regardless of what happens with the Electoral College, you do see that over time and in history, we have consistently won the national popular vote. And Republicans, I mean, that just tells Republicans very directly that the policies that they are proposing, which a lot of times do include anti-LGBTQ legislation, those things are not, they're not popular with the general public, whether folks identify as LGBTQ or not. This is not the stuff that people want worked on by their government officials. And so Republicans understand that the values that they are running on are not popular enough to get a broad swath of society to actually elect them. So they are insistent on just making sure that less people can vote, that less of the public can actually participate. So I would say, people have a tendency after elections, especially when you see elections like what happened with Georgia being able to give Democrats control of the U.S. Senate. People have a tendency to say, okay, great, election season is over. We're all done. We're all good. Everything's great. Biden got elected president. No, this is not the time to take your eye off the ball. You must stay engaged, because there are many, many, many serious fights that are coming up that actually that are not even directly about voter suppression. Many fights like the redistricting fight that we will have later this year. People should not underestimate how consistently their right to participate in democracy is being attacked. It is well coordinated, it is consistent, and it is well funded. And so because of that reason, it's essential that you stay engaged.
So a poll out this week from the AJC shows that most voters don't believe there was widespread fraud in the presidential election, and they have little appetite for new restrictions. But yet here we are with this raft of proposals. Mm-hmm. Jerry, is that sort of what you're hearing from folks that you work with in terms of your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there is no need for again perpetuating the false narrative around the election and the changes that are needed for this to protect the quote unquote integrity of the election, because the votes were counted 3 times in Georgia. There was a signature audit in Cobb County that found almost no fraud, and so there is the issues that I say are problems in our election having to do with access. We're fighting in litigation right now, the exact match process that the state implemented that disproportionately impacts Black and Brown communities. We are fighting in court again with regards to Spanish language access, because the state has a responsibility to send the Spanish language access for the absentee ballot application that they sent out in June. They had a responsibility to send it out to Gwinnett County voters that they did not send it out. So there are things that certainly that they're wanting to do to limit access, but there are things that they can do to expand access, and we're working to make sure that we can expand access. That's really what we need to be spending our time on, unfortunately. And we're not spending the time on doing those things that will make the democracy work better for us. And as the representative indicated, a lot of this is due to the redistricting that happens. How the lines get drawn determines the extreme polarization that we will have in our elected officials. That's why we have the crazy congressional member that was stripped of her committees because of the extreme polarization of that particular district. So the more extreme when redistricting happens to serve partisan purposes rather than communities that it's supposed to represent, that's when we really lose touch with what's happening with our democracy. And that's why it's going to be important. Yes, Georgia made history, but we can't sit on our laurels and take our eye off the ball to rest easy that everything's good from now on. We have to continue to be involved. We have to watch what's happening at the Georgia legislature, get involved against these voter suppression tactics, and also get involved in the redistricting process, which we are working on with a broad swath of community members to make sure that redistricting happens for our communities rather than for partisan purposes.
Well, and I think we've touched on a little bit of this, but if we can reiterate it, how can LGBTQ people get engaged in what's happening and help?
So I always say, again, I'll just repeat what I said before. There are organizations that make it their business to stay on top of what is happening. I will say that the voter suppression and really when any type of oppressive legislation comes up, it is really the tactic of those who are advancing that legislation to make it very difficult for the public to follow it. So this could be things like committee meetings getting changed last minute, public access to committee meetings being restricted. They know that the harder they make it for the public to participate, the easier it is to get this stuff passed. And of course, we know that sunlight is always the best disinfectant. So I always say that you should follow elected leaders like myself who are staying on top of these issues and who are using their newsletters to alert you as to what is coming up and what action you can take. But even beyond that, get with groups like Galileo, get with groups like New Georgia Project, sign up for their communications, because they are the masters at communicating exactly what is happening in plain language so that you can understand, what the animus is behind a lot of this stuff. And they let you know what actions are going to be the most effective for you to take to ensure that you don't lose your opportunity to participate in democracy in a very full way.
Jerry, any thoughts from you on reiterating how folks can get involved?
Sure. I mean, absolutely. I mean, we partner with a lot of groups. Georgia Equality comes to mind. The Common Cause comes to mind. The League of Women Voters comes to mind. There's groups that are focused on protecting democracy and making sure that democracy is greater, accessible to other folks. And certainly we welcome the LGBTQ community to be involved in that. The LGBTQ community is very diverse. So the Black and Brown community is represented in the LGBT community, so is the Asian community. So there's lots of ways for the communities to get involved and to stay connected with what's happening to make sure that we can lift up our voices together. When we do that, our voices are stronger. As we saw in the general election and in the runoff election, there is great strength and unity, and we need to come together and fight back against these initiatives that will curtail our efforts to vote in future elections. There is history that we can look at, that what happened in North Carolina. North Carolina flipped from red to blue, and then after it flipped from red to blue, there were very repressive voter access legislative initiatives, similar to what's happening right now in Georgia, that happened. So we need to make sure that we can look at recent history and fight back against these tactics, because they are out for our democracy. They want to retain power no matter what. And that means suppressing everyday Georgians' ability to be able to exercise their right to vote freely and fairly. And that's just not what we can stand for here.
Well, one last question for both of you. Where can people follow you and stay on top of what you're working on and what's going on? Renitta, do you want to?
Yeah. So I'm on I'm on Facebook, IG, or Instagram. Sorry, brain crash. Instagram and Twitter at Renitta Shannon. That's Renitta with 2 T's. And you can sign up for my newsletter that I send out. I always tell people I don't use my newsletter for you to see who came down to the Capitol that was famous and I took a picture with. Nobody cares about that. I use my newsletter for action alerts and to talk to you about the issues. So if you go to my website, RenittaShannon.com, you can see all of my social media stuff where you can follow me, and you can also sign up for my distribution list that's under the Contact Renitta tab. So
No TikTok?
You know what? I like to watch TikTok videos. I made one turning in a bill. That was kind of boring. So I don't know. I might get a little more active on TikTok. We'll see. Kind of busy, just a little bit busy trying to defend democracy in Georgia.
Right. What about you?
Yeah, you can follow Galeo at, we're on Facebook, galeo.org, also on Twitter, galeo.org. Instagram is Galeo_pics. And yes, we are on TikTok. Galeo TikTok is where we are. So we want to make sure that we're everywhere where our community is. And certainly we have to be connected with folks as best way as possible. So invite folks to follow us and to join our efforts.
So, Jerry, you and I are a similar age. So, do you have like a 20-year-old staffer that does your TikTok, or are you doing it?
I am not doing TikTok. As the representative said, it is addictive, but I'm not good at doing any TikToks. Our interns handle that pretty well, and they do a good job with that.
Good stuff. As we bring our Q&A to a close, I want to say thank you to Nsé Ufot, Jerry Gonzalez, and Representative Renitta Shannon for taking part. And I also want to say thank you to everyone who joined us today. In the meantime, you can stay on top of all things LGBTQ in Atlanta at Project Q Atlanta, the QATL.com. And with that, thank you again, everybody. Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.